Dinotopia, River Quest by John Von Horn. Chapter 1. A spray of scalding water hit Magnolia in the face, and she threw up one hand to ward it off. She didn't need to tell Paddlefoot to back up. The Lambiosaurus pivoted gracefully for a creature weighing 6 tons and standing 20 feet tall. 13-year-old Magnolia just hung on for the ride. Paddlefoot jogged several yards on his hind legs, then halted. Both of them looked back at the towering spume of water. The geyser shot 1,000 feet into the air, like an upside-down waterfall, and it turned the valley into a steam bath. Magnolia couldn't hear anything over the hiss of the steam, but she could smell the sulfur. She felt the presence of her master, Edwick, as he thundered to her side aboard his partner, Calico, a spotted Saltosaurus. She was relieved to see the yellow, green, and white colors and the water lily on Calico's blanket. Edwick and Calico were the habitat partners of Fresh Water, and Magnolia and Paddlefoot were their apprentices. "Report?" asked Edwick, who was an old man and didn't like to waste words on things like greetings. "Yes, sir," shouted Magnolia over the noise of the geyser. "We watched it for 2 hours, but it just erupted a moment ago. It's even bigger than we were told." Edwick rubbed his short white beard and stared at the amazing sight. "It's beautiful. But a new geyser could mean that earthquakes or problems with underground water channels are coming. It usually means old volcanoes somewhere close." "Volcanium is nearby," Paddlefoot pointed out, trying to be helpful. The dinosaur's voice was a series of hoots and bellows produced by his horn-like crest. Most humans couldn't understand him. But Magnolia and Edwick had spent years with Paddlefoot. They understood him perfectly. Edwick motioned around the small but perfect valley deep in the forest. "This whole area is a sunken volcano. I was going to recommend this area for farming, but I don't think I can do so now." Without warning, the geyser shut off. The spume that had been 1,000 feet high dropped down to a little squirt of steam. Finally, they could talk without shouting. "Maybe it's blown itself out," said Edwick. "The larger the geyser, the quicker it can blow itself out. Make note of that, apprentice." "Yes, sir," Magnolia answered, knowing that she would never forget it. "And why is that true, sir?" Edwick smiled. "A good apprentice always asks why. Imagine what is happening. Water collects in this series of underground chambers, where it's heated by molten rock. The water turns into steam. It expands and expands until it has nowhere to go except for the little hole in the rock, and then it explodes." When Magnolia jumped at his words, the old man laughed. "It shouldn't explode again until the water collects and reheats. If enough water has blown out, it might never explode again. So that is why the more water the geyser shoots, the shorter its life usually is." "I never thought of that," said Paddlefoot. Edwick reached into the backpack of the saddle and pulled out a long coil of rope. There were black stripes along the rope, and one end had a large weight tied to it. "We should take a measurement to see how deep the water is in the top chamber," he said. "I want to know how fast it's collecting. It could tell us if this will be a short-lived or a long-lived geyser. Wait here." "Sir," said Magnolia with concern, "you shouldn't get too close." "Didn't you say you watched it for 2 hours before it erupted? This will only take a few minutes. Back up a bit, take out your spyglass, and observe me. Are you ready, Calico?" For 50 feet around, all the greenery and dirt had been blown away by the powerful forces of the geyser. Paddlefoot moved well beyond the clearing, and Magnolia fumbled with her saddle bag for her spyglass. She extended the small telescope and put it to her eye just in time to see Calico and Edwick arrive at the silent geyser. She bit her lip nervously as she watched Edwick dismount from Calico and walk towards the geyser on his bowed legs. Edwick and Calico had spent many years patrolling the lakes, rivers, and streams and swamps of Dinotopia. It was their job to monitor all the fresh water on the island, including geysers. Edwick swung the weighted rope as if he hadn't a care in the world, and Magnolia began to relax. Edwick and Calico were always very careful, she told herself. That's why they had lived to such a ripe old age. When Edwick began to lower the weighted rope into the water, Magnolia concentrated on how he was doing it. Through the spyglass, which was a good one given to her by her father, she could see his lips moving as he counted off the marks of the rope. Because the geyser had frightened off most birds and small animals, it was extremely quiet in this part of the forest. She could hear her heart beating. "Something's wrong," said Paddlefoot in a hushed bellow. "What?" asked Magnolia. "It's quiet, that's all." Too quiet, snorted Paddlefoot. Without being able to help himself, the large Lambeosaurus began to shift around on his mammoth hind legs. He patted his front feet, pawed to the ground, too. Will you hold still? Demanded Magnolia. I can't see anything. Then the earthquake hit. It sounded like thunder and turned the ground into a rolling carnival ride. The sure-footed Lambeosaurus staggered, but didn't lose his balance. Somehow, Magnolia managed to stay in her saddle and not drop her spyglass. The quake lasted less than a minute, but it seemed as if they stumbled around helplessly for hours. When it finally stopped, the geyser erupted again. No! Screamed Magnolia. She touched Paddlefoot's thick neck, and the crested dinosaur leapt forward. Magnolia shielded her eyes as they rode into the mist of streaming water. She hadn't watched Edwick and Calico when the earthquake struck, and the geyser erupted, so she didn't know what had happened to them. Now she couldn't see them for the thick haze of steam. Paddlefoot nearly ran into Calico, who was backed up and craning her neck to see through the mist. The Saltosaurus made distressed gliding sounds in her throat, and Magnolia knew perfectly well what she was saying. Edward is hurt! Help him! The 13-year-old grabbed a coil of rope from his saddlebag and leaped off the Lambeosaurus. Hold still, she shouted at Paddlefoot as she dashed between his mammoth legs. Using the dinosaur's body as a shelter from the scalding water, she peered into the steam. It was then she saw Edwick, a pathetic lump trying to crawl out of the roaring steam. I found him, she told the dinosaurs. Paddlefoot, catch! She tossed one end of the rope to the dinosaur, who deftly caught it in his mouth. Then she rushed forward with the rest of the rope. She shielded her eyes and protected herself as best she could, but she felt the boiling water sear her skin. If she was going to get burned, she thought with alarm, what must be happening to Edwick? He was in the middle of it. When Magnolia couldn't get any closer, she uncoiled the rope. Catch! She shouted at the injured man, hoping he could hear her. There might not be another chance if she missed, so she threw the rope with all her strength and accuracy she could muster, and landed just inches in front of him. Grab it! She shouted. Grab it! With the last of his strength, the old man lunged forward and got his gnarled hands around the rope. Pull! She shouted to Paddlefoot. Slowly! The rope began to move, and she stared with fright as the steam to make sure that Edwick was holding on. He was. Hang on, she encouraged him. You're almost out of it. She tried not to think of the pain Edwick was suffering as Paddlefoot dragged him out of the steaming water. When the old man drew close to her and reached out under his arms and helped him hang on. When she touched the skin, she felt blisters. Even his white beard had been scorched off. Nevertheless, Edwick held onto the rope, and Paddlefoot kept pulling him to safety. Moments later, they were out of the worst of it, although the geyser kept spitting out water 1,000 feet into the air. Edwick, moaned Calico. The dinosaur nuzzled him with her big snout. He had used the last bit of his strength to hold onto the rope, and now the old man was unconscious. Magnolia tried to be brave, but one glance at Edwick's blistered skin told her how serious his injuries were. He's badly burned. We must get him to Volcanium as soon as possible. Calico snorted something to Paddlefoot, and the two dinosaurs craned their long neck to the ground and wiggled their snouts under Edwick. They lifted him up as if he were a feather pillow, and placed him gently into the saddle aboard Calico. Magnolia scrambled up with her rope and tied him to his seat. When she was done, she jumped down. Be gentle, but go slowly, she told Calico. We'll meet you at Volcanium. Then the big Saltosaurus took off at a brisk, steady walk, careful not to shake her wounded passenger. Magnolia gulped back tears. Edward could be brusque with her, and sometimes he treated her like a child. But she was barely a teenager, and she had so much to learn from him. Please let him be all right, she begged the fates. Please let Mr. Edward live. Let's follow them, said Magnolia. She tried to climb aboard Paddlefoot, but her hand slipped. She yelped with pain and became aware of her own blisters and burn spots. With their thick hides, dinosaurs had barely been affected by the scalding waters. You're not well either, the Lambeosaurus bellowed with concern. Let me help you. Hadrosaur spread himself on his belly to make sure it was easy as possible for Magnolia to climb onto his back. Thanks, said the girl. She felt sick, but she didn't know whether it was from her burns or worry over Edwick. She touched the dinosaur's neck, and he rose to his feet and gently walked forward. With her blistered hand, Magnolia couldn't use her reins, so she wrapped her arms around Paddlefoot's neck and hung on. She knew the journey would take at least 4 or 5 hours. The city of Volcanium sat on top of a stubbly mountain that had once been an active volcano. Now it was a manufacturing center, and the thermal energy from deep within the earth helped to forge jewelry, tools, hinges, and all kinds of metal goods. There were small villages surrounding the base of the mountain, and Magnolia and Paddlefoot headed to the nearest one. Word spread fast in Dinotopia, and human and dinosaur nurses came running out to greet Magnolia and Paddlefoot. Lambeosaurus knelt down on his front legs, and the nurses lifted the 13-year-old off and carried her into a white hut with a thatched roof. Paddlefoot clucked his tongue with concern. "What about Edwick?" asked Magnolia. "What about Edwick?" "He's resting, as you should be," said one of the nurses. "His burns are worse, but yours are bad too." She turned to a Protoceratops nurse. "Let's have the Longivius salve. Quickly!" When the dinosaur went to fetch some medicine, the human nurses laid Magnolia on a bed and began to strip off her dirty clothes. By the time the Protoceratops arrived with the salve, Magnolia was already starting to drift off to sleep. "Edwick," she muttered, "I want to see my master." "You will, my dear," cooed the nurse. "First you must rest. Rest is the most important thing now." Chapter 2. When Magnolia woke, it was dark except for a small lamp, and she felt confused by her surroundings. This wasn't her bed. Where was she? The smell of fresh bread was comforting, but there were jarring noises, a bell ringing, a clang of wagon wheels on the street. Magnolia started to get up, and stabs of pain along her skin reminded her of what happened. She touched her face and found that her burns were covered with salves and bandages. Now she remembered. She was in the village outside Volcanium. She lay back in bed, trying to calm herself. She wasn't actually hurt that bad. But what about Edwick? How was he? She just had to know. "Nurse!" she shouted. "Nurse!" A little Protoceratops hustled into the room, rose quietly up on her hind legs, and chattered to Magnolia to be quiet. The girl obeyed, knowing she wasn't any point arguing with the Protoceratops. As she lay still, hoping somebody would come visit her soon and answer the question that crowded her mind. Luckily, Magnolia didn't have to wait long, and somebody did come. It was an important someone. The muscular body of ch1-3 filled the doorway, the lamplight glitting off his bald head. He was the master metalworker, the most important human in Volcanium. "Are you awake?" he said in a thunderous voice. "Yes, sir," Magnolia answered meekly. "I didn't mean to cause a problem." "There's no problem," said ch1-3, stroking his long white beard. "You want to see Edwick, and he wishes to see you as soon as possible. Can you walk, or shall I carry you?" "I can walk," she said, swinging her legs out of her bed. Her burns were painful, but they were only on her hands and face, and her clothes had protected the rest of her body. The nurses had left slippers and a soft robe for her, all of which she slipped on. "Come on, then," said ch1-3. He was so big, and Magnolia was so short, only 5 feet tall, that she felt as if she were walking beside a dinosaur. They stepped outside into a deserted street of white cottages and flickering lampposts. The government buildings and foundries were at the top of the volcano, with a sleepy village that housed the workers right below. It was late at night. She must have slept a long time. "Is Master Edwick all right?" asked Magnolia, trotting to keep up with the metal worker. He nodded. "As well as can be expected with burns all over his body. He will live, but he will be healing for a long time." "But the habitat?" asked Magnolia. "Who will check the fresh water?" ch1-3 smiled. "This is why we must talk." He stopped outside the white cottage and tapped the door knocker. A moment later, a human nurse answered the door. She bowed and looked from the muscular man to Magnolia. "He is awake, but please do not stay long." "This is urgent business," said ch1-3. He ushered Magnolia inside the cottage. There were 3 patients sleeping in the living room, but the nurse directed them towards the back room. When they entered, Magnolia was relieved to find that the room was lit dimly by a single lamp, and she couldn't see Edwick's wounds clearly, but there was no mistaking that gruff voice. "Magnolia," he said fondly, "thanks to you I live to see another day." She knelt beside Edwick's bed and reached out to touch his arms, and then, worried about his burns, she put her hands on the bed railing instead. Edward looked so old and frail, not the dynamic man she followed from one end of the Dinotopia to the other. For 5 years, Edwick had been her mother, father, friend, and teacher. She knew he wasn't going to die, but she had to fight back tears just seeing him like this. "Did Talk tell you why I wanted to see you?" "No," she answered, "but I wanted to see you anyway." Edwick tried to smile, but bandages hid most of his face. "Congratulations, little Magnolia. Your apprenticeship is over." "What?" she gasped. You and Paddlefoot are the new habitat partners of Freshwater. At this moment, Calico is meeting with Paddlefoot and the elder dinosaurs. No, Magnolia groaned. I'm not ready. I'm too young. Edward croaked a laugh. Look at me. You're more ready than I am. You warned me not to go near that geyser, but I went anyway. When the apprentice has more sense than the master, it's time for the master to retire. Magnolia started to protest again, but Edward held up a bandaged hand. You and Paddlefoot have apprenticed for 5 long years. You are ready. What you lack in experience, you make up for in youth. You must leave tomorrow morning for Waterfall City to study the old maps and talk to Maddock and Nalum. I am worried about that earthquake. It may have effect on water levels or water equality. I'm worried too, said Magnolia, but that doesn't mean I'm ready to be a habitat partner. Tok Timbu laid his massive hand on her shoulders. Do not argue, young one. It is the master's decision to say when an apprentice is ready. Of course, the official ceremony that makes you and Paddlefoot the protectors of Freshwater will have to wait for another time. She will need a uniform, said Edwick. Yellow, green, and white. Tok Timbu nodded. Our villagers are sewing new clothes for her. They will be ready by morning. Edward touched Magnolia's arm with a bandaged hand. Carry the banner of the water lily proudly, he whispered, and protect the water. It is the lifeblood of Dinotopia. Magnolia swallowed and bit her lip. She could hardly speak with all the weight of responsibility falling on her slim shoulders. I will, she promised. Edward nodded and lay back in his bed. He seemed more at peace than Magnolia had ever seen him. Tok Timbu gently helped get the girl to her feet and escorted her out of the room. When they went outside, they found Paddlefoot waiting for them. He was already wearing Calico's saddlebag, which was green, yellow, and white, and wore the banner of the water lily. The dinosaur looked every bit as surprised and frightened as Magnolia felt, and she went to hug one of his burly hind legs. Tok Timbu nodded with satisfaction. You have been taught by the best. I have no doubt that you will do well. I must go now and send word over the crystal beacons. By tomorrow, all of Dinotopia will know that we have new habitat partners. Breathe deep and seek peace. With that, the giant metalwork left them standing in the dark village at the base of the mountain. Paddlefoot made a few plaintive hoots, and Magnolia hugged him again. Yes, I know, she said. We're all alone, and we have a big job ahead of us. I'm scared, too. Magnolia looked towards the top of the mountain, where the forges of Volcanium burned with an orange glow, lighting the night of Dinotopia. The next morning, Magnolia was delighted to find her new uniform laid out for her. It consisted of a white shirt, green tunic, yellow pantaloons, and best of all, a hat that matched the crest of Paddlefoot's head. When she put the clothes on, she finally sank in that it was real. She and Paddlefoot really were habitat partners of fresh water. She was a bit embarrassed at the send-off the village gave them. Of course, Dinotopians didn't need much of an excuse to celebrate, but an observer would have thought they were going off to save the world. Children and small dinosaurs followed them for miles down the trail, waving and cheering. Magnolia finally had to tell them to go home. The only sad part was that Edric wasn't there to see him off. His nurses wouldn't let him out of bed. Magnolia didn't want to see him lying in the bed weak and injured. She wanted to remember him the way he's always been, vibrant and full of action. But Calico came to say goodbye, and that was important to Magnolia and Paddlefoot. By midday, they were well on their way to Waterfall City. During their apprenticeship, Magnolia and Paddlefoot had traveled every inch of Dinotopia, and they knew every trail and shortcut. Magnolia had a great sense of direction. She often had to tell Edwick and Calico which fork in the road to take. The only area she didn't know very well was the Rainy Basin, but that was Tyrannosaurus Rex territory, and neither human nor dinosaur went there if he could help it. Magnolia carefully steered them around Hadro Swamp, which lay between Volcanium and Waterfall City. That added a few miles to their journey, but she didn't want to get stuck in the biggest swamp in Dinotopia, especially traveling alone. They would be spending enough time in the swamp when they made their annual inspection. Even with the detour, it was only about 40 miles between Volcanium and Waterfall City, and the Lambeosaurus covered the distance swiftly. Magnolia could tell that they were getting close when the terrain changed from lush forests to rocks and rivers. They stopped at a rest at a small canyon with a gently flowing river. She could tell from the mud along the bank that the water level in the river had fallen recently. but there wasn't much time to take measurements. They had to reach Waterfall City and see if there were any reports of worse damage. Paddlefoot hooted. How about a swim? Some hadrosaurs hated to swim, but Paddlefoot liked it, which was a good thing for a habitat partner of fresh water. Waterfall City lay at the junction of several rivers, the greatest being the Polongo. The footpath wound around the mountains, but the river was the direct route. Let's go, she answered. The dinosaur nodded and plunged happily into the river, but with the girl clinging to its back. Despite his great bulk, Paddlefoot could paddle with his padded front feet. He could also run along underwater in his strong hind legs. Paddlefoot and Magnolia had the current to help him, and were soon moving briskly along. By late afternoon, they were floating through the vast canyon with striped cliffs rising sharply on both sides of them. They could hear the roar of the great waterfalls from a long way off. Do you want to swim all the way in? Asked Magnolia.
No, hunked Paddlefoot. I'm too tired. The current's too rough around the waterfall.
How about a glider? Paddlefoot craned his neck to look at her, knowing she was joking. They were gliders that zoomed from great bluffs looking over the city, but they were only for humans and small dinosaurs. Creatures the size of Paddlefoot did not fly, nor did they trust boats very much. That leaves only the path behind the waterfalls, said Magnolia. The dinosaur hooted as if to say that was okay with him. Oh, I hate to go that way, muttered the girl. It's undignified for the new habitat partners to ride soaking wet.
Says who? Bellowed the Lambeosaurus.
Paddlefoot got his way, and they climbed out of the river before they went cascading into the basin around Waterfall City. Magnolia dismounted and let the dinosaur lead the way, first up the bluffs and then down a path leading into the waterfalls. Even though she had seen Waterfall City 100 times, she stopped to stare at the magnificent sight. It looked like a castle floating at the edge of the world. The heavy mists gave the building a surreal look, as if they were chalk paintings you could wipe away with your hand. Was it her imagination, or did the mists appear lighter today? The girl could easily make out landmarks she couldn't always see from here. She saw the golden dome that represented the earth and housed the great spiral clock. She could also see the pyramids, the library tower, even the giant statues of long-toothed lions that guarded the rivers as it flowed through the city. Even the water level of the mighty Pongolo River looked lower today, but it still wasn't low enough to swim in. Waterfall City was her favorite place on Dinotopia. She just wished there was an easier way to get to it. Magnolia looked longingly at the gliders shaped like pterosaurs. Each one ferried half a dozen passengers into the city. She also saw several skyboxes and one-person hang gliders, all of which delivered their passengers to the city in perfect dry condition. She wouldn't trade Paddlefoot for any of them, but someday she'd like to fly into Waterfall City for a change. As she stared at the towering waterfalls, she had an overwhelming realization. She and one lone Lambeosaur were in charge of keeping track of all of this. How could she live up to such a great responsibility? The thought made her want to run the opposite direction and let somebody else take the job. Paddlefoot could always sense her mood, and he hooted softly.
Do not be afraid, Magnolia. We can do it.
She shook her head. I don't know. I worry too much. Even now it looks to me as if the water level of the Pongolo River is low today. Is that possible?
Come on, snorted Paddlefoot, tromping down a path that led to the mouth of a giant cave.
Before she even reached the cave, Magnolia was drenched and shivering. The mist was so thick near the cave that she had to breathe through her mouth instead of her nose. She hoped it wouldn't be too slippery inside. After her eyes got used to the darkness, Magnolia relaxed a bit. They were in a deep cavern that wandered directly behind the waterfall created by the Pongolo River. Although it was a damp form of traveling, walking behind a waterfall was still rather exciting. Ahead of her, Paddlefoot had to be careful to avoid stalactites hanging from the ceiling and stalagmites rising from the floor. They were caused by the mist condensing and dripping through the cracks of the rock, leaving minerals behind. The noise of the plunging water reminded her of where they were. Between the stalactites and the stalagmites, she could see the waterfall. From behind her, it looked like a shimmering turquoise curtain, not tons of water, plummeting hundreds of feet per second. As they walked farther, she began to see gaps in the curtains of waters, gaps that had never been there before. She could even hear Paddlefoot's heavy footsteps sloshing through the puddles. In her many trips behind the waterfall, she never heard any sounds but the roar of the water. What was going on? Look, she told Paddlefoot, there's something wrong with the river. Chapter 3. The Lambeosaurus turned to look where it should have been a solid sheet of water.
Instead, there were huge gaps in the waterfall. In some places, it was only a trickle. He snorted. Did they divert the river? Magnolia could only shrug. She knew that every 100 years or so, the citizens of Waterfall City had to divert the Pongolo River to rebuild the cliffs. It had never happened in her lifetime. Would they divert the river without telling the habitat partners? She asked. If she knew Edwick and Calico, they would want to oversee such a complicated process. I don't know, hooted Paddlefoot. Nevertheless, the dinosaur quickened his pace, and Magnolia had to run to keep up with him. When they emerged from the other side of the cave, they had to climb several steps to reach the outer wall of the city. Even before they got to the wall, they could hear the cries and shouts from within. Nobody was even watching the gates when they entered. The city was in chaos. Humans were running around, shouting and pointing, dinosaurs were stamping and bellowing, dragon hordes sounded from the highest towers, and alarm bells rang. Humans and dinosaurs were rushing to the walls of the city, trying to get a better look. The river! Someone shouted. It's drying up! What's happening? Wailed a stegosaurus. Let's have Nalib. He'll know. Magnolia and Paddlefoot passed a large fountain that had stopped working for the lack of water. Suddenly they were spotted by a panicked crowd. The new habitat partners of Freshwater, a woman screamed. They will tell us. Within seconds, the young habitat partners were mobbed by worried citizens. Why is the water level dropping? What's happening? Tell us! Tell us! They all shouted at once. To keep from being swallowed up by the crowd, Magnolia quickly scrambled aboard Paddlefoot. Remain calm, she yelled at the top of her voice, not knowing what else to say. Her main concern was the great spiral clock. It wasn't a clock that kept minutes or hours. It was used to tell the time for planting, harvesting, and egg hatching. Unlike the other cities in Dinotopia, Waterfall City was totally dependent on water wheels for power. When the water level dropped too much, everything stopped. If a milling machine or a spinning wheel stopped turning, it wasn't so serious. But if the spiral clock stopped turning, all of Dinotopia would suffer. I must go see Malik, she told the crowd. This managed to calm them a little, as if something were being done. Magnolia was only 13 years old, but she knew that Dinotopians placed a lot of faith in the habitat partners. The people didn't see her age. They saw only the banner of the water lily. She urged Paddlefoot forward through the crowded streets. They passed dried canals, dried fountains, and giant water wheels that had stopped turning. Without water flowing through it, Waterfall City was a ghost of itself, like a town that had been deserted. They climbed the steps to the time door, just as Malik poked his head out. Malik was a thin Stenonychosaurus, hardly much bigger than Magnolia, but as the timekeeper he kept the pulse of Dinotopia. He waved frantically to them. Come in, come in! Magnolia leaped down and entered the small door, and Paddlefoot continued around the corner to the larger door built especially for large dinosaurs. Malik hurried the girl through the Time Museum. She'd always enjoyed seeing this collection of curious timepieces, carried ashore by newcomers from all over the world, but there was no time to look at them today. Malik and Magnolia reached the dome that housed the spiral clock just as Paddlefoot entered from the other side. As in the rest of the city, the river level had fallen so low that the water had stopped flowing through the sluice that turned the water wheel. Both it and the spiral clock were perfectly still. When it wasn't moving, the giant cone-like clock looked like a useless piece of junk instead of Dinotopia's greatest invention. This is a true disaster, clucked Malik. The water level started falling yesterday after the earthquake. It's getting worse by the hour. Do you know what's happening? Magnolia and Paddlefoot could only shake their heads. We've only just arrived, said Paddlefoot. Oh, yes, said Malik. Congratulations on your new post. I'm sorry you had to visit in the middle of a crisis, but I'm glad you're here. The door banged open, and a tall man with tufts of white hair on his head rushed into the room, his robes flowing behind him. This is terrible, he wailed. Just terrible. Calm yourself, Nalib, said the small dinosaur. We have a bit of luck. Here are the new habitat partners for Freshwater. The old man studied Magnolia and Paddlefoot and took a few deep breaths. I am calm now. What do you make of this? Magnolia wasn't used to people looking for her opinion, but she and Paddlefoot had wanted this job. They had been trained for it, and now they had it. We first saw that the water was dropping when we crossed behind the falls, she answered. We thought maybe you were diverting the Pongolo River to make repairs. No, said Nalab. We only do that after months of preparation and care. We've been sending out teams to check for damage in other towns. We weren't even thinking the river would be damaged. If this keeps up, people will abandon Waterfall City. I don't want to become like the Lost City. Let's think for a moment, said Magnolia in a calm, grown-up voice. The earthquake must have done something to divert the river. Can we send skyboxes upriver to see what happened? Malik shook his reptilian head. No! The Pongolo River winds through the rainy basin. This is the rainy season. Skybacks can't fly well in the rain, and it's hard to see what's happening in the cloud cover. Somebody must go on foot. Magnolia was aware that both Malik and Naleb were looking at her. She swallowed hard and glanced at Paddlefoot. She could tell he was thinking the same thing. He would want to slog through the rainy basin in the rainy season. Not to mention that there was a good chance of meeting Tyrannosaurus Rex there. She tried to think about Edwick and Calico would do. Yes, they would go. It was their duty. They wouldn't rush off, though. They would make preparations. All right, said the girl calmly. We need to plan things first. How long can the spiral clock be stopped before we have a serious problem? Malik answered. I can keep track of things with my pocket watch for about a week, but this is the middle of spring. There are plantings and hatchings and prunings. We can't go long without the clock. She turned to Naleb. We'll have to keep the citizens calm. Tell them we'll solve this problem. The old scholar nodded his head. I understand. But I don't need to tell you. Without the Pongolo River, Waterfall City will die. I know, said Magnolia quietly. She thought for a moment before speaking again. We've traveled all day, and almost dark. We'll start out at first light. We need supplies for a week and 2 dimorphodons to relay messages. People of the city are in a panic. You must tell them we're taking steps to solve the problem. I will do that, said Naleb. The old man started toward the door, then stopped. How do you like your first day as habitat partner? Paddlefoot honked. Never a dull moment. Naleb chuckled. I'm glad you're here. Believe me, I will send over some maps to help you. Paddlefoot and Magnolia stood on the observatory platform and gazed at the riverbed winding into the distance. After heavy rain, she'd seen the Pongolo River swell over its banks, but she never expected to see those banks empty. Magnolia had seen dry riverbeds in the desert, but they always were depressing, like a city without people or dinosaurs. She could see a dark cloud massing over the north of them. At least the rainy basin was living up to its name. They studied the maps that Naleb had sent them, but they weren't much help. The water in Pongolo River was dropping, but they couldn't see where it could have gone. They finally decided that Malik was right. There was no way to know what was going on without journeying up the river. Naleb walked out on the deck to join them. He was carrying 2 dimorphodons, one in each arm. Here are your traveling companions, he told the habitat partners. They're the best we have. The dimorphodons were small pterosaurs about the size of parrots. They were excellent at delivering messages. Some humans and dinosaurs considered them to be rather ugly and noisy, but Magnolia had always liked them. I grew up with dimorphodons in the house, she said. My father was a message writer in Sauropolis. Magnolia held out her arm to the small flyers. One of them immediately fluttered off Naleb's arm and landed on hers. She scratched the dimorphodon under its chin and asked, What's your name? Beepa, squawked the dimorphodon. She snuggled against Magnolia's hand. Seeing this, the other dimorphodon flew over to her arm and she scratched under his chin, too. Beepo, he chirped. Beepa and Peepo, said the girl. Are you good at remembering messages? This may be the most important message you'll ever carry. Naleb waved his hand. These 2 could memorize all the books in the library. They also know the countryside very well, and they're very strong flyers. Paddlefoot hooted. I'll need a basket to carry them. We're packing your supplies now, said Naleb. I think it's time you 2 had supped dinner and rested. You can't do more tonight, and you're leaving at first light. We've given you the guest quarters to use for the champion ring riders. That wasn't necessary, said Magnolia. She was used to sleeping in barns and haylofts. Yes, it is, said Naleb. You'll see how grateful we are for what you're doing. Come. Despite the worries about the river, the citizens of Waterfall City had still managed to show Magnolia and Paddlefoot their famous hospitality. Naleb showed them to the magnificent 2-story cottage. The lower level had a ceiling 20 feet high and a bed of hay for Paddlefoot. The upper story had a lovely bedroom with a view of the entire city. Lambeosaurus snorted. At least this job has some good points. The best chef served them dinner in the courtyard of the guest house. Magnolia ate delicious fruits, nuts, and honey bread, and Paddlefoot feasted on fresh, leafy vegetables. As promised, their supplies were already packed and ready to go. There was even a basket for the dimorphodons, who were fast asleep inside of it. Before going to bed, Magnolia gave a big Lambeosaurus a hug and an encouraging smile. You aren't afraid of this quest, are you? Yes, he honked. Me too. But at least we have each other. Good night, partner. The big dinosaur lowered his snout and tousled the top of her head. It was his way of hugging. Magnolia tried to sleep, but even on a soft bed, weary from a hard day, she found sleep difficult to come by. There was too much to think about, too much to worry about. What if they didn't solve the mystery of the lost river? What if Waterfall City became abandoned? This is what she wanted, she told herself. To be a habitat partner. All her life she wanted it, and she had begged her parents to allow her to apprentice. They weren't fond of the idea, because they had wanted Magnolia to follow in her mother's footsteps. Her mother was a gardener who tended the famous rose gardens of Soliopolis, the capital of Dinotopia. That was an important job, to be sure, but Magnolia wanted to travel. There were habitat partners for the skies, forests, mountains, deserts, savannas, beaches, and bays, but she had chosen freshwater, because freshwater was everywhere in Dinotopia. In her 5 years of apprenticeship, she had seen every lake, river, and swamp. She had visited every city, village, hatchery, and remote farmhouse. But she never imagined the day when all the fresh water flowing to these places would be her responsibility. That day had seemed too far off to think of. Now it was here, and she was frightened. Suddenly the words of Tok Timbu came into her mind. It is the master's decision to say when the apprentice is ready. Edward had decided she was ready. She had never questioned the decisions of Edward and Calico before, so she couldn't question their final decision. She would do the best she could and bear the banner of the water lily proudly. With that comforting thought, Magnolia was finally able to lose herself in sleep.